While other children dreamed of parties, birthdays, and Christmas presents, he learned to fear the end of the world. While others watched cartoons, he memorized texts about destruction, obedience, and punishment. Childhood within Jehovah's Witnesses is not just a phase. It is programming. An invisible mold that shapes the mind, the emotions, and imprisons the soul. Thousands grew up believing they were among the chosen people. But inside, they lived crushed by fear, by guilt, and by the constant feeling of not being good enough for God. This is the trauma that no one sees. The trauma of those who grew up inside and came out wounded within. The scars are not visible on the surface. There are no broken bones, no physical bruises that fade with time. Instead, there are invisible chains wrapped around the psyche, around the very core of identity and selfhood. These chains were forged in childhood, link by link, meeting by meeting, study by study. They were constructed with the language of love but delivered the substance of control. They promised salvation but delivered anxiety. They spoke of paradise but created a mental prison from which escape would prove extraordinarily difficult. For those who have never experienced life inside a high-control religious organization, it can be difficult to comprehend the depth and complexity of the psychological impact. From the outside, it might appear to be simply a matter of religious upbringing, no different from any other faith tradition passed down through generations. But those who lived it know differently. They know that what happened to them was not merely religious education. It was systematic conditioning that reached into every corner of their developing minds and shaped how they would see themselves, others, God, and the world for decades to come. The programming begins before the child has the cognitive capacity to question or resist. Before they can form their own beliefs, they are taught what to believe. Before they can develop their own values, they are given a complete value system. Before they can discover who they are told who they must become. This is not education. It is indoctrination. And its effects ripple through entire lifetimes, affecting relationships, career choices, mental health, and the fundamental sense of self. The children who grew up in this environment learned early that the world was divided into two camps: the righteous organization and everyone else. There was no middle ground, no gray area, no room for nuance. You were either in or out, saved or condemned, obedient or rebellious. This black and white thinking became the lens through which they would view everything, a cognitive framework that would prove extremely difficult to dismantle even years after leaving. They learned that love was conditional, contingent upon obedience, performance, and unwavering loyalty to the organization. They learned that questioning was dangerous, that doubt was a sign of spiritual weakness, that independent thinking was the first step toward apostasy and destruction. They learned to fear their own minds, to distrust their own feelings, to suppress their own authentic selves in favor of the approved version that would keep them safe within the protective walls of the organization. And so they grew up, not as free individuals discovering the world and their place in it, but as programmed beings, carefully molded to fit a predetermined pattern. They grew up with smiles on their faces and terror in their hearts. They grew up believing they had the truth, while simultaneously feeling that they could never quite measure up to its demands. They grew up in a paradise of doctrine that felt, internally, like a prison of expectation. A controlled childhood. Everything begins early. Before learning to choose, the child already learns to obey. Colorful books with messages of terror. Images of people being destroyed at Armageddon, while the faithful smile in a paper paradise. The world outside is the enemy. School classmates are bad associations. School is seen as a spiritual battlefield. Birthdays, parties, sports. Everything is prohibited, dangerous, sinful. The result is a childhood without belonging. A heart that learns early to isolate itself. The child learns to smile, but not to dream. Learns to obey, but not to think. The indoctrination materials designed for children are particularly insidious in their approach. They use bright colors, engaging illustrations, and simple language, all the hallmarks of quality children's educational materials. But the content is anything but child-appropriate. These books and videos present apocalyptic scenarios in which those who do not serve Jehovah are destroyed, often showing images of destruction, death, and divine judgment. For a young mind still developing the capacity to distinguish between reality and fantasy, between literal and metaphorical, these images are not abstract theological concepts. they are terrifying realities. Children as young as 3 or 4 are taught about Armageddon, shown pictures of buildings crumbling and people fleeing in terror, with a clear message that this fate awaits everyone outside the organization. They learn that their classmates at school, their neighbors, even extended family members who are not Jehovah's Witnesses, are all marked for destruction. They are taught to pity these people but also to maintain emotional distance from them, to never become too close, to always remember that friendships with worldly people are temporary and spiritually dangerous. The Kingdom Hall becomes the center of the child's life from infancy. Multiple meetings per week, initially 3, now consolidated but still consuming significant time, structure the family schedule. Children are expected to sit still and quiet for hours at a time, listening to adult content that is often beyond their comprehension. They are encouraged to participate by commenting at meetings, but these comments must align with the approved answers found in the study materials. There is no room for original thought, creative interpretation, or questioning. The child learns early that there is one correct answer to every question, and that answer has been predetermined by the organization. Field service, the door-to-door preaching work, begins almost as soon as the child can walk. They are taught a simple presentation, given a small bag to carry their literature, and brought along on what is essentially cold-calling strangers to tell them about an apocalyptic message of judgment. For many children, this becomes a source of intense anxiety and shame. They are made to feel responsible for the salvation of others, burdened with the belief that if they do not preach effectively, blood guilt will be on their hands. They stand at doors, feeling conspicuous and different, learning to associate their faith with embarrassment and social awkwardness. The prohibition on celebrating holidays creates a profound sense of otherness. While classmates excitedly discuss Halloween costumes, Christmas presents, or birthday plans, the witness child must explain, again and again, why they don't participate. They must stand outside the classroom during holiday parties, sit in the hallway during birthday celebrations, decline invitations to friends' festivities. Each exclusion reinforces the message that they are different, separate, not part of the normal world. They are told this difference makes them special, chosen, blessed, but it feels like loneliness. Sports and extracurricular activities are strongly discouraged as distractions from spiritual activities. Any pursuit that might foster worldly friendships or consume time that could be spent in service to Jehovah is viewed with suspicion. The child who shows talent in music, art, athletics, or academics is often discouraged from developing these gifts beyond a basic level. Higher education is explicitly warned against, painted as a spiritual danger that leads to pride, worldly thinking, and association with bad influences. The message is clear: your talents, your interests, your dreams, these things matter only insofar as they can be used to serve the organization. The result is a childhood characterized by restriction and vigilance rather than exploration and joy. The natural curiosity of youth is channeled into religious study. The energy of childhood is directed toward religious activities. The imagination that should be free to roam is constrained within the boundaries of approved thinking. These children grow up in a state of perpetual surveillance, watched by parents, by congregation elders, by other members of the community, and most frighteningly, by a God who sees every action, hears every word, and knows every thought. They learn to perform, to present the right image, to say the right things, to smile at the right times. They become experts at appearing happy, spiritual, and grateful, even when inside they are confused, lonely, or deeply unhappy. They learn that their internal experience matters less than their external presentation, that authenticity is less valuable than compliance, that being true to themselves is less important than being faithful to the organization. Many develop a split self, a public persona that is cheerful, obedient, and spiritually exemplary, and a private self that harbors doubts, questions, forbidden desires, and a deep sense of inadequacy. This psychological splitting becomes a survival mechanism, a way to maintain the approval and acceptance they desperately need while protecting some small part of themselves from complete assimilation. But this splitting comes at a cost, creating an internal division that can persist long into adulthood, making authentic integration of the self extraordinarily difficult. Guilt as a mechanism of control. In Jehovah's Witnesses, even thought is monitored. Feeling anger is sin. Doubting is rebellion. Desiring is impurity. Guilt is not a consequence, it is a tool. It shapes behavior and creates fear even of one's own thoughts. You grow up believing that God watches you all the time, and that a simple mistake can erase you from the book of life. The mind lives on alert. The heart lives tired. When you grow up believing that God can destroy you for thinking wrong, even breathing becomes an act of vigilance. The concept of guilt within this religious framework is all-encompassing and inescapable. Unlike guilt that arises from actual harmful actions, which serves a healthy psychological function by prompting us to make amends and change behavior, the guilt instilled in Jehovah's Witness children is pervasive, chronic, and often disconnected from any genuine moral failing. It is guilt for being human, for having normal thoughts and feelings, for existing as anything other than the perfect, spiritually minded individual the organization demands. This begins with the doctrine of inherent sinfulness. Children are taught that they are born imperfect, inherited sinners from Adam and Eve, fundamentally flawed at their very core. This is not presented as a theological abstraction, but as a daily reality that requires constant vigilance and correction. Every mistake, every moment of weakness, every failure to meet the organization's standards is evidence of this deep, inherent wrongness. The child learns that they cannot trust themselves, that their nature is fundamentally corrupt, that without constant submission to Jehovah's organization, they will inevitably drift toward destruction. The monitoring extends to thought life in ways that create tremendous psychological burden. Sexual thoughts are particularly targeted, treated as deeply sinful and dangerous. For adolescents going through normal physical and emotional development, this creates an impossible situation. Natural biological urges are reframed as spiritual warfare, evidence of Satan's influence, signs of moral weakness. Masturbation is explicitly condemned as a serious sin, requiring confession to elders. The shame and self-loathing this produces is profound, creating associations between sexuality and guilt that can damage intimate relationships for life. But it's not just sexual thoughts that are policed. Doubt is equally problematic. Questions about doctrine, confusion about teachings, uncertainty about whether the organization really has the truth. These are not treated as normal parts of intellectual development but as dangerous spiritual red flags. The child or teenager who experiences doubt is told that Satan is planting these thoughts, that they need to study more, pray more, do more in service. The message is clear. Doubt means you are failing spiritually, and failure leads to destruction at Armageddon. Even negative emotions become evidence of spiritual inadequacy. Feeling angry at the restrictions imposed by the religion? That's evidence of a rebellious spirit. Feeling sad about the isolation from worldly peers? That shows you're too attached to this system of things. Feeling overwhelmed by all the demands, meetings, study, field service, personal study, family worship? That indicates you're not relying enough on Jehovah. There is no emotional experience that cannot be reframed as a spiritual problem requiring more devotion to the organization. The confession process amplifies this guilt to extraordinary levels. Young people who struggle with normal developmental issues are encouraged, or required, to confess these to congregation elders, adult men who then ask detailed, often invasive questions about the nature of the sin. These judicial meetings can be deeply traumatizing, particularly when they involve sexual matters. The individual must describe their thoughts or actions in explicit detail to men who are often not trained in counseling or psychology, who view the situation through the organization's rigid framework of sin and punishment. The consequences of this constant guilt are severe and long-lasting. Many develop what psychologists would recognize as scrupulosity, a form of obsessive-compulsive disorder focused on religious and moral perfectionism. They become hyper-vigilant about their thoughts and actions, constantly examining themselves for evidence of sin, unable to relax or feel at peace. Prayer becomes not a source of comfort but another arena for performance and self-flagellation, as they beg Jehovah for forgiveness for thought crimes and struggle desperately to be good enough. This perpetual state of guilt creates a deep sense of unworthiness that pervades every aspect of life. The individual learns to believe that they are fundamentally flawed, that any good in them is not really theirs but comes from Jehovah despite their inherent badness. They struggle to accept compliments, to acknowledge their own achievements, to feel deserving of love or happiness. After all, if Jehovah, the being who knows them most completely, finds them so disappointing that only undeserved kindness keeps them from destruction, how can they possibly feel good about themselves? The exhaustion that results from this is not merely emotional but cognitive and even physical. The brain operating under constant stress and self-monitoring consumes tremendous energy. There is no rest, no moment when one can simply exist without evaluation and judgment. Sleep may be disrupted by anxious thoughts about spiritual inadequacy. Relationships are strained by the inability to be vulnerable or authentic. Joy is muted by the underlying current of unworthiness that runs through everything. The fear of rejection. Few pains are as deep as the fear of losing everything. Within the organization, obedience is not just spiritual, it is social. Disobeying means being cut off, expelled, forgotten. Family, friends, colleagues, all are trained to turn their faces away. Silence becomes punishment. Love, a currency of exchange. That's why so many adults live repressing who they are. Pretending, smiling, serving. Because they know that just one doubt, one word, and punishment comes in the form of loneliness. The threat is not hell. It is the silence of those you love. The doctrine of disfellowshipping and shunning is perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of the Jehovah's Witness system. This practice requires that all members completely cease association with anyone who is formally expelled from the congregation, even if that person is a close family member. The stated purpose is to maintain the spiritual purity of the congregation and to motivate the disfellowshipped person to repent and return. The actual effect is to create a climate of terror in which the threat of total social annihilation keeps members compliant even when they have serious doubts or objections. For someone who has grown up as a Jehovah's Witness, virtually their entire social network exists within the organization. Their family members are witnesses. Their friends are witnesses. Their social activities revolve around the congregation. They have been explicitly instructed to avoid forming close bonds with worldly people, so they lack the external support systems that others take for granted. The organization becomes not just a religion but the totality of their social world. This creates a profound vulnerability. The individual knows, because they have seen it happen to others, that if they are disfellowshipped, they will lose everything. Parents will no longer speak to them. Siblings will cut off contact. Friends of decades will pass them in the street as if they don't exist. Even a simple greeting is forbidden, as this is seen as showing support for someone whom Jehovah has rejected. The isolation is total and devastating. The reasons for disfellowshipping can include many things that the outside world would consider personal choices or matters of conscience. Smoking, celebrating holidays, questioning doctrines, engaging in premarital sex, accepting a blood transfusion, dating a non-witness, or even simply fading away from the organization without formally disassociating. The rules are strict and the enforcement is consistent. Once the elders make their decision, the shunning begins immediately. Children grow up witnessing this process. They see beloved family members suddenly become non-persons. They are told not to mention the person's name, not to ask questions about them, to treat them as if they have died, except worse than death, because there is no mourning process, no closure, no acknowledgement of the loss. They learn that love within the organization is entirely conditional, that even the deepest family bonds can be severed instantly if religious compliance falters. This creates a particular form of attachment trauma. The child's fundamental need for secure attachment, the knowledge that they are loved unconditionally and that their caregivers will be there for them, is undermined by the implicit threat that this love can be withdrawn at any moment. They learn that to be loved, they must perform. They must believe the right things, say the right words, maintain the right appearances. Their value as a person is tied not to their inherent worth but to their usefulness to and compliance with the organization. The psychological impact of this dynamic is profound. Many develop what psychologists call anxious attachment styles, constantly seeking reassurance and approval, terrified of abandonment, unable to fully trust that they are loved for who they are. They become hypervigilant to any sign of disapproval, reading into every interaction evidence that they are about to be rejected. They may become people-pleasers, losing themselves in the attempt to maintain the approval they need to survive. For those who begin to doubt or who develop interests and values that conflict with organizational teachings, the situation becomes agonizing. They face an impossible choice: remain authentic to themselves and lose everyone they love, or continue to pretend, to live a lie, to suppress their true thoughts and feelings to maintain relationships that are fundamentally conditional. Many choose to stay trapped, living double lives, slowly dying inside while maintaining the external appearance of faithful membership. The threat of shunning extends even beyond formal disfellowshipping. Those who are spiritually weak, who miss meetings frequently, who don't participate in field service, who show signs of insufficient zeal, often experience what might be called soft shunning. They are gradually marginalized, their calls not returned as promptly, their invitations to social gatherings becoming less frequent. They are marked as bad association, particularly for young people who might be influenced by their lack of spiritual vigor. This creates a system of continuous behavioral reinforcement in which any deviation from the expected level of activity and enthusiasm results in social consequences. The most heartbreaking aspect of this system is how it turns family members against each other. Parents are instructed to shun their own children. Adult children must cut off aging parents. Siblings who grew up together must treat each other as strangers. The natural bonds of kinship and affection are subordinated to loyalty to the organization. Families are torn apart, and those who remain inside are told that this is an act of love, that shunning will help the wayward one realize the error of their ways and return to the fold. The reality, of course, is quite different. The shunned individual typically does not interpret this treatment as loving. They experience it as betrayal, abandonment, and cruelty. The pain of being cut off by family can be so severe that some contemplate or attempt suicide. Others experience what amounts to disenfranchised grief, mourning the loss of relationships with people who are still alive but completely inaccessible. The members who remain inside and enforce the shunning also suffer, living with guilt and sorrow over the enforced separation, but feeling they have no choice if they wish to remain in good standing with Jehovah. The invisible trauma in adult life. Years later, many leave the religion. But the trauma stays. It hides in thoughts, in reactions, in relationships. In every sorry for existing. In every difficulty in trusting. They are adults afraid of disappointing. Afraid of feeling. Afraid of being free. Anxiety disorders, depression, fear of God. The programming continues operating even outside the organization. You leave the religion, but the religion doesn't leave you so easily. The decision to leave Jehovah's Witnesses is rarely simple or sudden. For most, it is the culmination of years of internal struggle, doubt, research, and agonizing contemplation of the consequences. Some leave because they can no longer accept the doctrines intellectually. Others leave because the psychological burden becomes unbearable. Still others are forced out through disfellowshipping. But regardless of how the exit happens, what awaits on the other side is not immediate freedom but rather a long and difficult journey of recovery. The first challenge many face is the simple practical matter of rebuilding a life. Those who grew up in the organization often lack the educational and professional development that their peers have achieved. Higher education was discouraged, so they may have only a high school diploma even in their 30s or 40s. Career advancement was seen as worldly ambition, so they may have remained in low-paying jobs that allowed them to pioneer or serve at Bethel. Financial literacy may be poor, as planning for retirement was unnecessary when Armageddon was always just around the corner. The practical task of establishing financial stability and career trajectory at an age when others are already well established can be overwhelming. Social skills present another major hurdle. Those who were raised as witnesses often missed key developmental experiences that help people learn to navigate the wider world. They didn't attend birthday parties or school dances. They didn't join clubs or sports teams. They didn't have casual friendships or romantic relationships in the normal way. As adults leaving the organization, they find themselves socially inexperienced, uncertain how to make friends, how to date, how to simply exist in social spaces without the structure and rules they've always known. The world that was always painted as dangerous and immoral now must become home, but it feels foreign and frightening. The loss of community is perhaps the most immediately painful aspect of leaving. Virtually overnight, the person loses their entire social network. Friends stop returning calls. Family members enforce the shunning policy. The individual suddenly finds themselves completely alone, without the support systems that most people rely on during difficult transitions. They are grieving multiple losses simultaneously: the loss of relationships, the loss of belief system, the loss of identity, the loss of their imagined future in paradise. This grief is often disenfranchised, meaning there are no social structures to support them through it, no rituals to mark the losses, no community to acknowledge their pain. But beyond these immediate practical and social challenges, the deeper psychological effects of the indoctrination begin to reveal themselves. The programming that was installed in childhood continues to run like background software, affecting thoughts, emotions, and behaviors in ways the person may not even recognize initially. The fear that was instilled so deeply doesn't simply vanish when intellectual belief changes. The guilt patterns that were established early remain active. The damaged sense of self persists. Many ex-witnesses struggle with persistent anxiety that seems to have no clear cause. They startle easily. They feel unsafe in the world. They experience a generalized sense of dread. Upon closer examination, this anxiety often relates to the apocalyptic worldview that was so deeply embedded. Even though they no longer intellectually believe in Armageddon, the emotional imprint remains. Their nervous system was trained for years to exist in a state of high alert, constantly vigilant for signs of the end, always aware of spiritual danger. That physiological state doesn't simply turn off when belief changes. Depression is also extremely common among those who leave. This depression has multiple sources. There is the grief of losses already mentioned. There is also the profound disillusionment that comes from realizing that everything you were taught, everything you based your life on, was not true. The foundation has been pulled out from underneath, and the question, "What else was I wrong about?" can be paralyzing. Additionally, many struggle with a loss of meaning and purpose. If you were raised believing that you had the most important job in the world, warning people about Armageddon and helping them survive, leaving that behind can create an existential vacuum. What is the point of life now? What makes anything meaningful? The relationship with the concept of God becomes complicated and often painful. For some, leaving Jehovah's Witnesses means leaving all religious belief. The betrayal by the organization that claimed to represent God makes any form of spirituality feel dangerous or impossible. For others, there is a desire to maintain faith but tremendous confusion about what that might look like outside the only religious framework they've ever known. Many struggle with religious trauma syndrome, a pattern of symptoms that result from traumatic religious experiences, including nightmares about divine judgment, panic attacks triggered by religious stimuli, and hypervigilance about spiritual matters. Trusting others becomes extraordinarily difficult. When you've experienced betrayal by the people who were supposed to love you most, family members who shunned you, spiritual leaders who abused their authority, a community that turned its back on you, learning to trust again requires immense courage. Many ex-witnesses keep people at arm's length, afraid to become vulnerable, expecting that they will eventually be rejected or betrayed again. This makes forming new, healthy relationships very challenging. Perfectionism and the fear of making mistakes often persist long after leaving. Years of being monitored and criticized for every small failing create adults who are terrified of doing anything wrong. They may struggle with decision-making, paralyzed by the fear of making the wrong choice. They may be intensely self-critical, unable to extend to themselves the grace and understanding they would readily offer others. The internal voice of the organization continues to judge and condemn, even when there is no longer any external enforcement. Many also struggle with identity issues. When your entire sense of self was constructed around being a Jehovah's Witness, leaving means losing not just beliefs but your understanding of who you are. The question, "Who am I without the organization?" can be terrifying. Some experience a kind of identity crisis in their 30s, 40s, or even later, going through developmental stages that most people navigate in adolescence and young adulthood. They must discover their values, their interests, their boundaries, their authentic self, all while managing the practical demands of adult life. Guilt also persists in complex ways. Even when the person intellectually rejects the organization's teachings, they may still experience guilt when engaging in previously forbidden activities. Celebrating a birthday or Christmas might bring unexpected anxiety. Engaging in a romantic relationship might trigger old shame responses. The rational mind knows these things are not wrong, but the emotional conditioning runs deeper than rationality. Perhaps most painfully, many ex-witnesses struggle with feelings of worthlessness and self-hate. They internalize the message that they were never good enough, that they were inherently flawed, that even Jehovah's mercy toward them was undeserved. Rebuilding a sense of inherent worth, learning to believe that you deserve happiness and love simply because you exist and not because you've earned it through performance, can take years of dedicated healing work. But there is hope. There are those who look back in pain and still decide to walk forward. The first step is understanding. You are not broken. You were conditioned. The second is allowing yourself to feel. Allowing yourself to live what was forbidden. Joy, doubt, freedom, love. Therapy helps. True faith, the kind that doesn't control, but liberates, helps even more. One day, you realize that God's love never depended on a tower. and that his kingdom was never imprisoned in kingdom halls. The trauma was real. But healing is too. Those who survived this carry a strength that the system tried to erase, but couldn't. And you? How many parts of you are still trapped inside that kingdom hall? The journey of recovery is not linear. There are setbacks and breakthroughs, moments of profound grief and moments of unexpected joy. But for those willing to do the difficult work of healing, a life of authenticity and freedom is possible on the other side of this trauma. The first crucial step in recovery is often the process of education and reframing. Understanding that what happened was not normal religious upbringing but rather systematic indoctrination makes a tremendous difference. Reading about high control groups, mind control techniques, and religious trauma helps the individual recognize that their struggles are not personal failings but predictable outcomes of the environment they experienced. This knowledge reduces shame and provides context for the healing journey. Many find tremendous value in connecting with other ex-witnesses. Online communities and support groups provide validation, understanding, and practical guidance from those who have walked the same path. There is something profoundly healing about being understood without having to explain, about sharing experiences with people who truly grasp the unique challenges of leaving this particular organization. These communities become a new kind of family, one based on shared experience and mutual support rather than conditional loyalty to a belief system. Professional therapy, particularly with a therapist who understands religious trauma or has experience with former cult members, can be invaluable. A skilled therapist can help the individual process grief, challenge distorted thinking patterns, develop healthy coping strategies, and work through the layers of conditioning. Specific therapeutic approaches like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, and eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR, have proven particularly helpful for religious trauma. The process of recovering includes learning to trust yourself again. Trusting your thoughts, your feelings, your perceptions, your judgments. For so long, these were all suspect, needing to be filtered through the organization's teachings. Learning that your mind is not your enemy, that your instincts and intuitions have value, that you are capable of making good decisions for yourself, this is revolutionary for someone who is trained to distrust their own thinking. Part of recovery involves experimenting with previously forbidden experiences. This might mean celebrating a first birthday or Christmas, trying new foods or activities, exploring different belief systems, or simply giving yourself permission to exist without constant productivity and spiritual performance. These experiences, while sometimes triggering anxiety initially, gradually help build new neural pathways and emotional associations. They provide evidence that the world outside the organization is not the terrifying, immoral wasteland it was portrayed to be. Healing also requires grieving, truly grieving, the losses incurred. This means acknowledging the pain of lost relationships, lost time, lost opportunities. It means feeling anger at the organization and the individuals who harmed you, even while recognizing that many of them were also victims of the same system. It means mourning the childhood you didn't have, the authentic self you had to hide, the years spent in service to beliefs that were not true. This grief work is essential and cannot be rushed or minimized. For many, part of the healing process involves redefining spirituality on their own terms. Some find their way to different religious traditions that offer community without control, faith without fear. Others develop personal spiritual practices that are meaningful to them. Still others embrace secular humanism or atheism, finding meaning in human connection, contribution to society, and the beauty of the natural world. There is no one right path, and the freedom to explore and choose is itself a crucial part of recovery. Rebuilding a sense of identity involves discovering who you are apart from the role you were assigned. This might mean exploring career paths that were previously forbidden, developing talents and interests that were suppressed, forming your own political and social views, and determining your own values. It means asking yourself questions that you were never allowed to ask. What do I actually believe? What matters to me? What kind of life do I want to create? Who do I want to be? Learning to set healthy boundaries is another essential skill. Those raised in the organization often struggle with boundaries because they were taught that saying no to the organization's demands was sinful. Recovery involves learning that it is okay, necessary even, to say no, to protect your time and energy, to distance yourself from people and situations that are harmful, to prioritize your own well-being. Developing self-compassion may be the most transformative aspect of healing. After years of harsh self-judgment and impossible standards, learning to treat yourself with kindness, to speak to yourself with gentleness, to forgive yourself for being human. This changes everything. Self-compassion practices, such as those developed by researcher Kristen Neff, can be particularly powerful for ex-witnesses who struggle with perfectionism and self-criticism. For those who were shunned by family, the question of how to relate to those relationships, if at all, is complex and personal. Some maintain hope for eventual reconciliation. Others come to accept that their family members may never leave the organization and learn to build a chosen family from friends and supportive community members. There is no right answer, and the individual must navigate this based on their own needs and circumstances. Recovery also involves reclaiming joy. For so long, joy was conditional, limited to theocratic activities, and always tinged with awareness of the suffering world and impending judgment. Learning to experience uncomplicated joy, in nature, in art, in relationships, in simple pleasures, without guilt or qualification is a profound shift. It is permission to be happy, to enjoy life, to exist without constantly justifying that existence through productivity and service. The process of healing takes time, often years. There may be triggers that arise unexpectedly, bringing back old feelings of fear or guilt. There may be times when the loss of family and community feels unbearable. There may be moments of doubt about the decision to leave. But gradually, with support and intentional healing work, the trauma's grip loosens. One day, perhaps years into the journey, the person realizes that they have gone an entire day without thinking about the organization. They notice that they no longer have nightmares about Armageddon. They recognize that they are forming genuine friendships based on mutual care rather than shared religious belief. They see that they are making decisions based on their own values rather than internalized organizational rules. They feel joy without the shadow of guilt. They experience the freedom to simply be themselves. This is when they understand that while the years in the organization cannot be erased, they do not have to define the rest of their life. The trauma happened. It was real. It caused significant damage. But they are not permanently broken. They are resilient. They survived. And with each day of healing, they are creating a new story. One where they are the author of their own life rather than a character in someone else's script. Those who have walked this path possess a unique strength. They know what it is to question everything they were taught. They understand the courage it takes to leave the familiar, even when it was harmful. They have learned to rebuild from the ground up, to trust themselves, to find meaning in a world they were taught to fear. They have faced the abyss of existential uncertainty and chosen to keep moving forward anyway. This strength, forged in the fire of deconstructing and rebuilding, is not the strength the organization tried to instill, the strength of unquestioning obedience and endurance through hardship in expectation of future reward. It is something altogether different. The strength of authenticity, of resilience, of choosing yourself even when the cost is high, of building a life of meaning and connection without the scaffolding of absolute certainty. And so the question remains, for those still trapped or recently freed, how many parts of you are still sitting in that kingdom hall? What fears still control you? What beliefs still limit you? What authentic parts of yourself are still waiting for permission to exist? The answer to these questions is the beginning of liberation. The journey is difficult, but you do not have to walk it alone. Thousands have gone before you. Thousands are walking it now. And on the other side of this pain is a life that is truly yours, not prescribed by an organization, not controlled by fear, not contingent on performance, but authentically, beautifully, messily, wonderfully yours. The trauma was invisible to the outside world, but it was profoundly real to you. And now, the healing, equally real, equally profound, is possible. The chains that bound your mind and spirit can be broken. The child who learned to silence their questions can finally speak. The adolescent who lived in fear of divine judgment can finally breathe freely. The adult who has been pretending for so long can finally step into authenticity. This is not just survival. This is reclamation. This is resurrection of the self. This is the triumph of the human spirit over systems designed to control it. And in choosing to heal, in doing the difficult work of recovery, you honor not only yourself but every person still trapped, showing them that escape is possible, that life after the organization is real, and that freedom, true freedom, is worth whatever costs to achieve it.